When my Aunt Karen invited me to stay at her place for a few weeks, I thought it would be a simple arrangement. I had some exams to prep for, and her house was quiet and peaceful, just what I needed. I hadn't seen her in a few years, and my memories of her were all tied to family gatherings where she was just Aunt Karen, kind, always smiling, and someone I didn't think twice about. But when I arrived at her place, it didn't take long for things to shift. The moment she opened the door, something clicked. Karen wasn't just the same person I remembered. She looked different. Maybe it was just because I was seeing her from an adult's eyes now, but I couldn't ignore the way she filled the doorway, her figure more noticeable than it had been when I was a kid. She smiled, but there was something in her eyes that made me hesitate. She was still my aunt, but I felt something change in that moment. "David, wow, look at you. You've really grown," she said, her voice light and welcoming. I grinned, trying to shake the strange tension that hung in the air. "Yeah, it's been a while. Thanks for letting me stay here." As we hugged briefly, I could feel her body against mine in a way that made me suddenly aware of the distance, or lack of it, between us. She pulled away quickly, but that first touch lingered longer than it should have in my mind. The first few days passed without much happening. I was focused on studying, and she kept herself busy with the house. Still, I noticed the way her presence filled the space, the way her footsteps seemed louder in the quiet house, and how I became hyper-aware of every little thing she did. It was like I couldn't look away. One afternoon, she walked into the kitchen while I was sitting at the table with my laptop. She was wearing a loose top and shorts, something casual, but the way she moved in it made me suddenly feel uneasy. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made me think maybe I should get out of the house more. I tried to keep my focus on my work, but my eyes followed her movements, almost against my will. "Need a break?" she asked, catching me off guard. "Huh." I blinked, pulling my gaze back to my screen. No, I'm good. Just trying to focus." She smiled, leaning against the counter, and for a second, I thought I saw something in her expression that wasn't there before. "You're working too hard, David. You should relax. You'll burn out if you keep staring at that screen all day." I nodded, feeling my throat tighten. She was right, but that wasn't what had me nervous. It was her being here, so close, talking to me like we weren't family, like there was something more hanging between us. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, avoiding her gaze. The days started to blur together after that, but the tension between us only grew stronger. I don't know if she felt it too, or if I was just imagining things, but there was something unspoken in the air every time we were in the same room. I'd catch her watching me, her eyes lingering just a little too long, and then she'd quickly look away, pretending she was focused on something else. One night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with thoughts of my upcoming exams, but if I was being honest, it wasn't just that. It was Karen. The way she looked at me, the way she spoke to me, it was confusing. I wasn't sure what to make of it. She was my aunt, and yet, there was this strange pull, like something forbidden was tempting me every time I looked at her. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to clear my mind, but it wasn't working. I could hear her moving around downstairs, probably finishing up her evening routine. The thought of her down there, so close, made it even harder to relax. I had to get out of my head, or I'd go crazy. I got up and walked down the hall. As I passed her door, I hesitated for a second, wondering if I should knock, maybe talk to her, clear the air. But I didn't. Instead, I went downstairs and poured myself a glass of water, standing by the kitchen sink, trying to shake off the tension that had settled in my chest. "Can't sleep either?" Her voice startled me, and I nearly dropped the glass. I turned around, and there she was, standing at the doorway in a thin nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. It was the first time I'd seen her like this, and it caught me completely off guard. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I guess I've got too much on my mind," I replied, my throat dry. She walked over to the counter, leaning against it as she looked at me, her eyes scanning my face. "You shouldn't worry so much. Everything will work out." There was something in her voice, a softness that felt intimate, and I couldn't help but notice how close she was standing. Too close. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I could feel my palms getting sweaty. I wanted to step back, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring at her, trying to read her expression, but it was impossible. Then she reached out, placing a hand on my arm, her touch sending a jolt through me. "You've been working so hard, David. You need to relax." I froze. The warmth of her hand on my skin felt like it was burning, but in a way that made me want more. This was wrong. I knew that. She was my aunt. But in that moment, all I could focus on was how close she was, how her touch felt like an electric current running through me. I'm fine," I stammered, trying to step back, but her grip on my arm tightened just slightly. "You don't seem fine," she said softly, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. My mind was racing, torn between what I knew was right and what I wanted in that moment. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't escape, a tension that had been building for days. Her hand slid down my arm slowly, and I could feel my resolve crumbling. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew one thing. Things between us had just crossed a line, and there was no going back. That night, something shifted between us. I had tried to ignore it, to chalk it up to my imagination, but the moment she touched me, there was no denying it anymore. We were standing too close, and the space between us wasn't just physical. It was something much deeper. I stepped back, trying to regain some distance, some control. "Karen, I should go back to bed," I said, my voice shaky. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I meant it. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw the same uncertainty I was feeling reflected in them. But then she smiled, just a small, knowing smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Of course," she said softly, stepping back, letting me go. But as I turned to leave, I could feel her eyes on me, lingering, watching. When I made it back to my room, I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, my mind racing. What the hell was I doing? This was my aunt. She was married to my uncle. This wasn't supposed to happen. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she had looked at me, the warmth of her touch, the way her voice had softened when she spoke to me. There was something there, something I couldn't explain, and as much as I tried to fight it, I couldn't deny that I wanted more. The next few days were tense, to say the least. Karen and I avoided each other, at least in any intimate setting, but the tension was always there, simmering just beneath the surface. Every time she walked into the room, I felt it. Every time she looked at me, I felt it, and I could tell she felt it too. One afternoon, Jack called from the road. He was stuck on a long-haul trip and wouldn't be back for another week. I could see the way Karen's face lit up when she got off the phone, a subtle shift in her demeanor that I couldn't ignore. It was as if she was relieved, as if his absence meant something more than just the silence in the house. "Looks like it's just you and me for a little longer," she said casually, but the way she said it made my heart skip a beat. I nodded, trying to act like it didn't affect me, but we both knew it did. The thought of being alone with her for another week, with that tension growing between us, made it hard to breathe. That night, I found myself tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep. My mind was filled with thoughts of Karen, her touch, her smile, the way her body seemed to move in slow motion every time I saw her. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see her. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way down the hall to her room. I stood outside her door for a moment, hesitating, wondering if I was making a huge mistake. But the pull was too strong. I knocked softly, my hand trembling. "Come in," her voice called from the other side. I pushed the door open slowly, and there she was, sitting on the edge of the bed in a silk nightgown that barely covered her. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked up at me with those same eyes, the ones that had been driving me crazy for days. "I couldn't sleep," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She smiled softly, patting the bed beside her. "Neither could I." I sat down next to her, feeling the heat radiating from her body. The air between us felt thick, like we were both holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there, staring at my hands, trying to keep my mind from going to the place it had been going for days. Then, without a word, she reached out and took my hand. Her touch was gentle, but it sent a jolt through me, just like it had the first time. I looked up at her, and there was something in her eyes, something raw, something vulnerable. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't stop thinking about you." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "Me neither," I admitted, my voice barely audible. She moved closer, her body brushing against mine, and I felt the air leave my lungs. Every nerve in my body was on fire, and I knew we were crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But I didn't care. I wanted her. I had wanted her since the moment I walked through the door. Her hand slid up my arm, her touch sending shivers down my spine, and before I knew it, our lips were inches apart. I could feel her breath on my skin, warm and inviting, and all I wanted to do was close the gap. And then, we kissed. It wasn't gentle or slow. It was intense, filled with all the tension that had been building between us for days. Her hands tangled in my hair as she pulled me closer, her body pressing against mine, and I could feel every inch of her. For a moment, everything else disappeared. There was no right or wrong, no guilt or hesitation. There was only her, and the way she made me feel, alive, in a way I hadn't felt in years. But as the kiss deepened, reality started to creep back in. I pulled away, breathless, my mind racing. "Karen, we shouldn't." She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Regret, maybe, or something deeper. "I know," she whispered, her voice shaky, "but I can't stop." Neither could I. We sat there in silence for a moment, both of us trying to make sense of what had just happened. I knew this was wrong, but at the same time, I didn't want to stop. The pull between us was too strong, too overwhelming. "I don't know what we're doing," I said quietly, my heart still pounding. She looked at me, her eyes soft but determined. "We'll figure it out," she whispered, leaning in to kiss me again. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. We had crossed the line, and whatever came next, we would face it together.